the New India House, 3 East 64th Street. A widely respected scholar and religious leader in India, Swami Bhaktivedanta is briefly visiting New York. He has been engaged in monumental endeavor of translating the 60-volume Srimad Bhagavatam from Sanskrit into English. So Prabhupada writes on November 28, Daud Harun had never met Srila Prabhupada. He was a musician living downtown, and he used to attend the meeting of the Tagore Society upon 64th Street. So he described his experience in his own word as follows. I went uptown and walked into the auditorium, and I noticed that the stage was empty and a few people were sitting toward the near of the auditorium. I walked forward down the center aisle because I usually like to sit up front. Then I saw an old gentleman sitting over to the right, and he sort of drew me over to him. So I went over and sat beside him. And then I noticed that he was saying his beads. Even though he had his beads in a bag, I could hear them. I could see his body moving, and I felt very comfortable because this was something I was used to. As I was sitting there looking around the auditorium, he just turned around and smiled at me very nicely. He nodded his head, and I nodded my head. And he smiled and turned around. Then he turned back to me again and softly asked me if I was from India. I said, no, sir, I'm not from India. I'm from here, the United States. He turned back and he kept chanting with his beads. Then he turned around the next time and asked if I was a Hindu. I said, no, sir, I'm not a Hindu, I'm a Muslim. And he said, oh, very good, very good. Yes, many times I hear the children in India reciting the Quran. And then he turned back around and his body was moving, rocking, and he was working with his beads. Then there were a few more exchanges of pleasantries, sort of intermittent. And then a lady come up on the stage and announced that the lecture was to begin, and if the folks could give the speaker a round of applause, they would welcome him to the stage. At that point, the man I was sitting next to put his hand on my shoulder and said, excuse me, sir, could you do me a favor? And I said, yes, anything. He said, would you watch over my books? I looked down on the floor and he had several boxes of books and an umbrella and several other articles. I said, yes, I would watch over this. And he said, excuse me. He walked up the aisle and surprisingly, he walked up on the stage. And it was the man I had come to hear, Swami Bhaktivedanta. He walked up on the stage and introduced himself to the people and tried to get them to come forward. He said, close, quote, come forward, come forward. A few of them came up to the front. There were mixed couples, many Indians, male and female, mostly middle-aged and some college age. A lot of professor types and ladies were there. Then he began his speech. He dove right into it. He just started exclaiming, proclaiming the greatness of the Creator. And the most important thing is to remember the Creator and remember God. He began to expand on God consciousness, what God consciousness is, and how God is everywhere, and how it behooves us all to remember God. No matter what we call Him, what names we will call Him by, but that we should call Him. He gave a demonstration which was very moving. He chanted Hare Krishna, Hare Ram, and spoke about the power and saving grace in the mantra. He took a little break about halfway through and had some water. The last thing he said as he was coming down from the podium was that he had copies of Srimad Bhagavatam. He explained that he had been working on them and that they came in 3 volumes and were $16. Then he concluded and came down. A lot of people went over to him. Some were timid, some were enthusiastic. Some people shook his hand and were asking for books. At first, there were about 15 people gathered around him, talking to him and asking questions. With so many people around, he came over to me and said, "Sir, would you do me one more favor? Will you kindly take over the selling of the books? People will be coming to you for the books. So you sell the books and put the money in this little box. And I'll be with you in a minute." I said, "Fine." So while he talked to the people, others came up to me. They must have thought I was somehow his secretary or his traveling companion. And people were coming over to me and asking me personal questions about him, which I couldn't really answer because I didn't know. Some people were buying the books or looking through them. So this went on, and I was trying to listen to him, carry on his conversation with people, and carry on the book selling at the same time. Some of the people were looking for a guru and trying to find out what he was supposed to be. Some of them were really interrogating him, but he just smiled and answered all their questions simply. I remember he told them, quote, "You will know. There is no pressure. You will know if I am your guru," unquote. He suggested that people go over and read the books. And then the group dwindled down to about half a dozen. And the few remaining were just looking at him, and some were too timid to approach him. He walked over to them and spoke to them, putting them at ease. Later he came over and we counted the collection, and I helped him pack up his box and carry downstairs the boxes of books that were left. As we parted, he thanked me very much, and I gave him my name and address and phone number and purchased a set of Srimad Bhagavatam. Very good. So now we are embarking on chapter 4. It will not be possible to assist you. Very good. I have come a letter from Srimati Moraji. I have come here in this old age, neither for sightseeing, not for any personal interest, It is for the interest of the entire humanity that I'm trying to implement the science of Krishna, which will actually make them happy. So it is the duty of every devotee of Lord Krishna to help me by all means. November passed and December came, and Prabhupada, having obtained an extension on his visa, stayed on. America seemed so opulent, yet many things were difficult to tolerate. The sirens and the bells from fire engines and police cars seems like they would crack his heart. Sometimes at night he would hear a person being attacked and crying for help. From his first days in the city, he had noted that the smell of dog stool was everywhere. And although it was such a rich city, he could rarely find a mango to purchase. And if he did, it was very expensive and usually had no taste. From his room, he would sometimes hear the horns of ocean liners, and he would dream that someday he would sail around the world with a Sankirtan party, preaching in all the major cities of the world. The weather went below freezing, colder than he had ever experienced in India. Daily, he had to walk toward the Hudson against a west wind that even on an ordinary winter's day would take your breath away and make your eyes water and your face grow numb. Terrible. On a stormy day, the driving wind and sudden gust could even knock a man down. Sometimes a cold rain would turn the streets slick with rice. The cold would become especially severe as one approached the shelterless, windswept area of West Side Drive, where occasional whirlwinds carried brown leaves and paper trash mysteriously high into the air. Srila Prabhupada wore a coat Dr. Mishra had given him, but he never gave up wearing his dhoti despite the cold, windy walks. Swami Nikhilanand of the Ramakrishna Mission had advised Prabhupada that if he wanted to stay in the West, he should abandon his traditional Indian dress and strict vegetarianism. Meat eating and liquor, as well as pants and coats, were almost a necessity in this climate, he had said. Before Prabhupada had left India, one of his godbrother has demonstrated to him how he should eat in the West with a knife and fork. But Prabhupada never considered taking on Western ways. His advisor cautioned him not to remain an alien, but to get into the spirit of American life, even if it meant breaking vow he had held in India. Almost all Indian immigrants compromised their old ways, but Prabhupada's idea was different, and he could not be budged. The others may have had to compromise, he thought, but they had come to beg technological knowledge from the West. Quote, I have not come to beg something, he said, but to give something. In his solitary wanderings, Srila Prabhupada made acquaintance with a number of local people. There was Mr. Ruben, a Turkish Jew, who worked as a New York City subway conductor. Mr. Ruben met Prabhupada on a park bench, and being a sociable fellow and a world traveler, sat and talked with the Indian holy man. Mr. Ruben explained in his own word as follows. He seems to know that he would have temples filled up with devotees. He would look out and say, I'm not a poor man, I'm rich. There are temples and books. They are existing. They are there, but the time is separating us from them. He always mentioned we and spoke about one who sent him, a spiritual master. He didn't know people at that time, but he said, I'm never alone. He always looked like a lonely man to me. That's what made me think of him like a holy man. Elijah, who always went out alone, I don't believe he had any followers. When the weather was not rainy or icy, Prabhupada would catch the bus to Grand Central Station and visit the Central Library on 42nd Street. His Srimad Bhagavatam were there, some of the same volumes he had sold to the US Embassy in New Delhi. And he took pleasure in seeing them listed in the card catalog and learning that they were being regularly checked out and read. He would sometimes walk through UN Plaza or walk up to the New India House on 64th Street, where he had met Mr. Malhotra, a consulate officer. It was through Mr. Malhotra that he had contacted the Tagore Society and had secured an invitation to lecture before one of their meetings back in November. Riding the bus down Fifth Avenue, he would look out at the building and imagine that someday they could be used in Krishna consciousness. He would take a special interest in certain buildings, one on 23rd Street and one with a dome on 14th Street attracted his attention. He would think of how the materialistic has constructed such elaborate buildings and had yet made no provision for spiritual life. Despite all the great achievement of technology, the people felt empty and useless. They had built these great buildings, but the children were going to LSD. December 2nd. New York Times headline, quote, New York City hospitals report marked rise in LSD cases admitted for care, unquote. Protest against US participation in Vietnam War mounts. The weather grew cold, but there was no snow in December. On Columbus Avenue, shops were selling Christmas trees, and the Continental restaurant were bright with holiday lighting. On 72nd, the Retailers Association erected tall red poles topped with green tinsel Christmas trees. The top of the trees on the both sides of the street sprouted tinsel garlands that span the street and join in red tinsel stars surrounded by colored lights. Although Srila Prabhupada did no Christmas shopping, he visited many bookstores, Orientalia, Sam Weiser's, Doubleday, the Paragon, and others, trying to sell his Srimad Bhagavatam. Mrs. Ferber, the wife of the Paragon Book Gallery proprietor, considered Prabhupada a, quote, a pleasant and extremely polite small gentleman, unquote. The first time he called, she wasn't interested in his books, but he tried again, and she took several volumes. Prabhupada used to stop by about once a week, and since his books were selling regularly, he would collect. Sometime when he needed copies to sell personally, he would come by and pick up from Mrs. Ferber. And sometimes he would phone to ask her how his books were selling. Mrs. Ferber explained in his own word as follows. Every time he came, he would ask for a glass of water. If a customer would make such a request, I would ordinarily say, there is a water cooler. But because he was an old man, I couldn't tell him that, of course. He was very polite always, very modest, and a great scholar. So whenever he would ask, I would fetch him a cup of water personally. Once Prabhupada was talking with Mrs. Ferber about Indian cuisine, and she mentioned that she especially liked samosas. The next time he paid her a visit, he brought a tray of samosas, which she enjoyed. Very good. Harvey Cohen came often to room 501 to visit the Swami, who had so impressed him at Anand Ashram. Harvey explained in his own words as follows. The room he occupied was a tiny office in the back of the Yoga Society in uptown Manhattan. I began to go there regularly, and we sat facing each other on the floor in this little office with his typewriter and a new tape recorder on top of the two suitcases. And there was a box of books he had bought from India and a color reproduction of dancing figures, which he looked at often. I told Swami Bhaktivedanta that I was an artist, and he asked me to please paint the picture of the dancers, which he explained was of Lord Chaitanya and his disciples. The painting was called Sankirtan. Whenever I came to visit him, Swami would always be happy to see me. I told him about myself, and we chanted Hare Krishna together in his room many nights that winter. I would get the train uptown from my apartment to go and see him. Now January 11, 1966. Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri died of a heart attack while visiting Russia. The Prime Minister had been a personal acquaintance of Srila Prabhupada's in India and an admirer of his Srimad Bhagavatam translation. He had been scheduled to visit America. And Prabhupada had expected to obtain a personal sanction from him for the release of the fund from India. His untimely death was a great upset in Srila Prabhupada's plan to purchase the building at 143 West 72nd Street. The realtor had shown him the building, and he had already mentally designed the interior for deity worship and distribution of prasadam. The money was to come from India, and Prime Minister Shastri was to give personal sanction for release of the funds. But suddenly, that was all changed. January 14th. Makar Sankranti. Prabhupada decided to write to the owner of the building, Mr. A. M. Hartman. He explained how his plans had been upset and he posed a new plan. Now the Prime Minister, Mr. Lal Bahadur Shastri, is suddenly dead, and I'm greatly perplexed, as there is now great difficulty for getting money from India. I'm requesting you to allow me to use the place for the international institution for God consciousness, at least for some time. The house is lying vacant for so many days without any use. And I learn that you are paying the taxes, insurance, and other charges for the house, although you have no income from there. If you, however, allow this place for this public institution, you shall at least save the taxes and other charges which you are paying now for nothing. If I can start the institution immediately, certainly I shall be able to get sympathy locally, and in that case, I may not be required to get money from India. I'm also requesting that your honor become one of the directors of this public institution because you give a place to start the institution. A.M. Hartman wasn't interested. So on the same day he wrote, Mr. Hartman, Prabhupada received a letter from Sir Padmapat Singania, the director of the very large JK organization in India. Prabhupada had written Sir Padmapatji for financial support, and his reply gave him hope. Not only was the Singania family fabulously wealthy, but its members were devoted of Lord Sri Krishna. So he writes as follows. My dear Swamiji, I have gone through your letter and I'm very glad to note your idea of erecting a Sri Radha Krishna temple in New York. I think the proposal is a good one, but the following are the difficulties. One, we have got to send foreign exchange for building the temple, for which government sanction is required. Without the government sanctions, no money can be sent abroad. If the government of India agrees, then one can think of erecting the temple in New York. Two, I doubt whether with this small amount of Rs, rupees 7 lakh, that's about 110,000 at that time, a temple can be built in New York. I mean to carry out a nice construction with Indian type of architecture. To get a temple completed in Indian type of architecture, we have to send a man from India. These are the two main difficulties. Otherwise, your idea is very good. So Srila Prabhupada and Mr. Singania had a basic disagreement. A magnificent Indian temple in New York would cost many millions of dollars to construct. Prabhupada knew, of course, that if Padmapat Singhania wanted, he could provide millions of dollars. But then how would they get so much money out of India? Prabhupada therefore again suggested that they spend only 7 lakhs. After purchasing the house, he wrote, We can build another story upon it with a temple dome, chakra, etc. Prabhupada has his own line of reasoning. I think we should stop here. We should leave something in suspense. What was his reasoning was. With those thoughts, we should end our session unless someone has any question, comment, corrections. Anybody has anything to add, subtract? Very poor involvement in discussion, I think. Haribol. Sudhir Krishna Prabhu may have to leave now. Haribol Prabhu, have a nice day. So just to, yes, Sudhir Krishna Prabhu, you want to say something? No. Oh, okay. So yesterday, I feel